So good afternoon, Chair Dittmeyer, Vice Chair Palmer, and members of the Board of Supervisors. Dr. Acuff and I are here with you today to present the school division's funding request. I would like to acknowledge the County Executive Tom Foley and our Superintendent Pam Moran and their staff members for the collaborative work they have completed since the end of our last budget cycle. The process has been incredibly improved, and I think that is entirely due to their efforts. I know both boards are very appreciative. I also want to acknowledge Jennifer Butler, who's here with us today, and Tony Borash, one of our instructional coaches, for their creation of today's presentation, doing something a little different with the presentation plan. So members of the board, this funding request is a needs-based request, and it is driven, I forgot to turn it on. Oh, it did buzz. So this funding request is a needs-based request, and it is driven by our strategic plan with the goal of keeping up with the service levels that we are providing in the current school year. I don't want to understress the point that we are bringing forward a very austere request. We know the revenue picture is not good. We directed the superintendent to bring forward a funding request to us that met the needs of the current year. I believe she did so, and now we bring that funding request forward to you. In the presentation today, we have an overview of our schools. And as you all are quite aware, we are a very large division, both physically and with many schools inside of our boundaries. A picture of our employees who are our most valuable asset. Not just our teachers, but also our classified employees. All the employees of our County schools are indeed seen as educators. An overview of our students. We are over 13,600 students now in Albemarle County. You can see a breakout of those students by different indicators that we sometimes look at. And we have a very diverse population of students in our school division. Also have included are some interesting facts or highlights about our division, if you would. As Jennifer mentioned, as in our preparation for the presentation, that our drivers travel over 14,000 miles per day. And what was it? It was like 3 times to California and back? 3 times to California and back in one single day in Albemarle County with our school bus drivers. Now, in comparison to the state, Albemarle County does very well. We're well above the state average in many, many indicators that we look at when we think of academic success. And we are particularly proud of our dropout rate in Albemarle County. So what are the primary drivers of our budget request, or our funding request this year? Well, obviously it's to maintain market compensation. It's to keep up with the quality of service that is currently being provided, and it is to fund our enrollment growth that we're seeing in new students. Now, this is what our community has said and prioritized in terms of what they feel our funding request should include. And as you can see, the top priority is increased employee compensation, followed closely by keep current or reduce current class sizes. Class size, as number 3 says, is to fund the growth in student enrollment. If you do not fully fund growth in student enrollment, of course, that does impact class size, which also then can impact compensation. Now, to introduce our expenses and revenues, and before we dive a little deeper into the details, we have a visual that I'd like to share that will show our current state of service and the changes we face looking into next year. So it's a very brief, under a minute long video that I'd like to show. Dive deeper into, we're going to begin first with expenses. Dr. Acuff will take over.
Good afternoon, members of the board. If you look at the top 4 little tiny circles at the top of the costs, those are our new expenditures for this year. And if you take a deeper dive into that, you will see that 97% of the total new expenditures are driven by either directed or mandated costs and growth. About 57% in directed and mandated, and 40% in growth, enrollment growth. And the 2 tiny slivers at the top, which I'll talk about in some more detail, are small 1% of the new growth goes to restoration of some services, some programs cut previously, and then the 2% purple is systems improvements. Directed and mandated, I think we all have a pretty good idea of what that is. Those are costs that we've either agreed as a county to expend or things that we really can't avoid. They're mandated by state or federal government. Or increased costs such as increased utility costs. But the highest element in this list is our insurance costs. And we had a very extensive presentation in the fall by Laura Jerome. So we understood that this was coming. This $2.2 million is partly actual per person increase costs, but about $800,000 of the $2.2 million comes from people who have been bumped off of either the UVA or the UPS health insurance programs. They now don't permit spouses, if they have an alternative source of insurance, to be on their plans. So about 800,000, about 70 people that represents. With respect to our agreed upon salary increases at the county and schools level, we have a half-year salary increase built into the budget, which is 2% for teachers, 2.3% for classified staff. We propose in our budget to add an additional quarter year. We will use our funding reserves to cover an additional quarter for our staff, so they're not taking home even less in the fall because of the health insurance costs than they are now. CSA, I know both sides, both county and the schools, have significant contributions for that. Voluntary retirement incentive program. More people are anticipated to be retiring, but a major component of that incentive program is healthcare costs. So those are reflected in that line item as well. We have others that I won't go into. We do have some cost savings, but the net is $3.88 million. Part of our commitment to our schools, and one of 2, in my view, major variables that ensure quality education is compensation and support of our teachers and other staff. And we see that with the salaries that they have now, 63% of those who responded to a survey indicate that it's economically necessary for them to supplement their salaries. They can't survive. They can't easily live in Albemarle County on their salaries. If you look at a comparison range, this is not the comparison range that we use to calculate their salaries, but it's a comparison of other high-performing school districts in the state. And you see that we're very competitive. We're pretty competitive at the low and entry level, but once you get toward people in the system for 15 years or with advanced degrees, we flatten out pretty quickly. And if you compare us to Loudon or Falls Church, we're 30-35% lower in compensation. And again, this is not news to you, I'm sure, but if you look at gross salary, we had years of no increases. The subsequent increases have been very modest, and they have not kept up with increasing insurance costs, inflation, taxes, et cetera. So the net take-home pay now versus 2010 is about 6.3% less than it was now than in 2010.
So to take a deeper dive into look at what our growth is. Growth this year takes up $2.72 million to cover the new growth. And you can see a breakout in how that impacts our instructional services. And this will include things like transportation, the impact more students in our physical buildings. All that is taken into account in the number. Now, looking at student enrollment, this current school year, we have 122 more students in the buildings than we projected last year in the funding request. So this is based on our September 30 data, 122 more students in our schools than we anticipated providing services for. Next year, we are projected to even have more attend, 189 additional students. So the additional increase in the current year and the increase in the coming year put a significant strain on keeping up with the level of services that we're providing. Now, the increase in students continues to trend upward for those who qualify for free and reduced lunch. The number is slowing, but it is still moving upward. And also continuing to trend upward is the increase in ESOL students we are serving. Now, as the chart shows, this segment of the population did take a significant jump a couple of years ago, and now that continues to significantly trend upward. Now, enrollment growth alone requires additional funding to pay for additional services if you have more students. When the new students include free and reduced lunch students, ESOL students, special education students, who require additional services, that puts a further strain on the revenue source to then meet and continue to provide the services you're currently providing.
ESOL students, just for people that might be listening, are
English is a second language students. Thank you, Ben.
And just to emphasize, I mean, we have students who are from homes that speak over 80 languages. And we have to provide education, and they may vary also, not only in their English skills, but in their background educational skills when they come to us. The two small dots in the bucket of new expenses, restoration is the smallest. We have put into our funding request additional funds for professional development. One of the most serious levels, and I'm sorry about the light blue, you can't see it very well, but one of the biggest cuts we've made over the past 8 budget cycles has been in professional development. If you look at our funding level in 2008, 2009, it was cut to 44% in the 2010-11 budget cycle. And we've been slowly and only incrementally increasing that funding. If you look at any of the research on what factors into a quality education, class size is important, but support and funding and continued training of our teachers is critically important. And our mission statement for our schools is to promote lifelong learning, and we have stripped away funding to permit our teachers to continue their lifelong learning. And especially with an increasingly complex student mix, we really need to have resources into that professional development. What we are talking about doing is adding, you see the numbers don't seem to add up. We're talking about adding about $225,000 to restore professional development, but we're only asking for $58,000, almost $60,000 from the county, because we will wait to fund a new assistant principal, assistant superintendent, and use that $160,000 plus to go into restoring some of the professional development funds. We feel so strongly of the importance of this expenditure item. The other sliver, about 2% of the added, the new costs, the new expenses, are 3 items. This is by no means our wish list. It is a very scaled back list of things that we believe are quite important for good functioning schools. Right now, our middle and high schools have full-time school nurses, but our elementary schools do not. We had originally had, I think we have 0.8 FTE across our 16 elementary schools, and we would like to increase to full-time the school nurses at our 5 largest elementary schools. those elementary schools with more than 500 students. That's Amberhurt, Baker Butler, Brownsville, Cale, and Greer Elementary. Collectively, that's 3,131 students who last year had over 35,000 school nurse visits. Right now, we don't have coverage when the kids arrive at school or when they're going home, that sort of transition time when they're at risk for injuries, I would say. And we're paying them for 0.8 FTE, but with all the paperwork that the nurses have to do, they're actually working more than that to get the work done. Secondly, behavior management. We used to have full-time truancy officers and people doing these functions of disciplinary hearings, truancy, alternative education, risk assessment, or threat assessment have been sort of dispersed throughout division. We would like to have a half-time person to coordinate this across division. And third, world languages. This is our 4th budget cycle for our world languages program at Cale. And we had hoped to expand the program across more elementary schools by now. All we're asking for, and we realize that that's not feasible, but we're asking for money to plan for expansion at 2 elementary schools. We've had a lot of interest from parents and PTOs and even our teachers. And some of the schools are being quite creative and having after-school programs with a little bit of language. And we would like to expand that.
Just to make a quick point on the truancy item, I mean, that falls to the principal. The person that's in a school, if students aren't showing up, they have to track down where they are. And that can require a significant amount of time, not just to find out where they are, but then why they're not in the school building, and then the things that are necessary to get them into the school building. And thinking of the instructional leader of our school, there are other things they should be focused on, that we should be able to provide support and helping with truancy efforts in those ways so that the principal can stay focused on being the leader of the building. That should be at their disposal in order to do their job.
This is not an additional person, this is the person.
This would be to assist with, so
Right,
we're not,
but
you know,
this is not
This is a
funding
half-time. This is
an
funding.
additional
Correct.
truancy. This is the person that's doing it.
There are no
There are
There are no
That's what I'm
truancy
saying, this
officers.
is not an additional person.
right now
This
our
is the
principals
person.
are doing that, where other places will have full-time truancy officers. So this is it wouldn't even get the job done, it would just offer some help in getting the job done. Now let's take a look at our revenues. And of course, our current gap stands at $880,000 approximately, and that, I have to tell you, is a far cry lower than the $4.4 million we were projecting or seeing or thinking about in the fall. When the superintendent brought forward her funding request, the gap stood at $3.1 million. So just in the short time from her funding request to the one we're bringing forward with you, we have seen improvement in adjustments to what our funding gap, or to the amount of that funding gap. So this chart does show the gap. The next item does show the current year's adopted budget, what our current funding request for the coming school year is, and the change that exists. And I think it is important to note out that, as I'm sure the concern is shared on the Board of Supervisors side, that we have had to dip into our capital projects in order to move some of that money over to operations. On the school side, that means some modernization efforts in our Red Hill project, which has been delayed many times in the past. So while I understand, and I think the school board understands why we are doing that, it is disconcerting that we're having to do that.
Like some of that, also school buses?
Is school buses as well? Is that being, well, that's,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
That's a reduction we're supporting because we believe we could extend the life.
Right, it was one of those CIP.
Yes.
So you just push the school or the bus out a little bit further into its traditional life cycle. Now, when the question is asked, and I really want to emphasize this to each of you, that when the question is asked why the continued responsibility for local government to provide additional revenue to fill a funding gap in the school division's funding request to allow them to keep up with the services, the answer is simply the state. The state is not doing their part. Now, based on the state's level of commitment in 2008-09, and if you adjust for inflation, we would have an additional $8.14 million more at our disposal. Now, we could be using that money to fund our enrollment growth. That wouldn't be an issue. We could be doing significant compensation increases for our teachers and our staff. And we could be implementing our strategic plan, which many of the goals and the points on our strategic plan have been deferred. We're not even attempting to get at our strategic plan at this point. Even if you do not adjust for inflation, if just the dollars remain the same, we would have over $3 million at our disposal right now to use for those items. Now, when we look at our state's investment in students, individual students in that same vein, in the current year, the state is underfunding our students by $584 per student. Next year, they'll be underfunding by about $602.
Can you explain on this graph that under 2015-16 you used the word estimated?
Well, the population with the students are estimated because we're using a projection for the students that we're calculating.
So does that
Whereas,
mean that you don't necessarily know for sure that?
If no students showed up and we had the same amount, then I would expect it would stay at 584. So based on the so based on the projected students that we're thinking are coming, the 189, that's how that number's counted.
So it's more related to student population, not related to funding, not really state.
Well, if they were funding at the levels, we would.
Right, but
So if you think if, like we say, we spend approximately $12,000 per student, that's our expenditure. That number would be, if you had more state revenue, that number would be increased by that amount when you look at it from a per student standpoint. So it's the same as this type of analysis. It's the total dollars available to us. This breaks down to our actual, what they're giving to us to help pay for that $12,000 some dollars that we spent. Decisions by the state legislator have shifted millions in costs to the local taxpayer in Albemarle County. You know it on your side. They've done the same thing on the local county side in different ways. They've done it on the school side, so the burden continues to come back to the localities around the Commonwealth to step up and fund where they are deficient. Kate's going to take us into the next segment.
What's at risk? We have worked, the schools have worked for many years on developing a portfolio of excellence. We want to be a major center of education. We want to compete with all the schools in the state and elsewhere. And we have put into our portfolio of excellence many things that are beyond the bare minimum standards that the state requires. We promote and support visual and performing arts. We have now our third STEM Academy at Western High School. We have a variety of enrichment opportunities and advanced placement, dual enrollment, virtual courses, and one rural language program. But we have had to whittle away at many of these elements in our portfolio in order to balance the budget. We're now, this will be the 8th budget or funding request since the Great Recession, and we have students now entering middle school who've only known a stripped-down budget. And given the importance of schools in any community and their economic development and their economic appeal to employers and people moving into the community, we need to make sure we can keep as much of this in our portfolio as possible. One of the key elements that we have focused on over the years is keeping our class sizes small, and you can look at some of the comparisons with other high-performing school districts. And we are envied by many because we have continued to maintain low class sizes, small class sizes in our elementary school. In our middle schools, we're not the very smallest, but we still look quite good. And also in our high school, we are, in this group, we have, compare us to Prince William County, for example, where their average class size is 30 students in a high school class. We believe that this is one of the key elements in continuing our excellence in education. But we've done so on a shoestring. And as I said, this is our 8th budget cycle where we have cut. And if you look at our expenditures per student, our per pupil investment, we are below the national average. We spend at $12,154. We're almost $4,000 per student less than Charlottesville City. That's extraordinary. What is the difference? That's a good question. How do
Hey,
you-
let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Because you referred to several times, you cut on your budget, but you're saying what happened, we've given you more money each year.
Right.
It's not been as much as you've requested, so it's not been a reduction in the amount of money for the previous
No,
year.
it's been a cut to professional development. It's been a cut in staff in central office. It's been a cut to building services and
To
transportation.
expansion of those particular services.
No,
because
it's been
it's
actual
been more
cuts.
money.
It's been actual cuts to all of those programs. What we have seen since 2008 is over 1,000 new students in our school system. And we have made cuts in order to absorb them and maintain our relatively small class sizes.
I just want to be clear that the board has given, you had more money to spend each year.
We've had
It's
more
not been a
money.
reduction in spending.
Correct, you're
From our
right.
source.
The overall amount is greater, but it's not at the same per pupil expenditure level, given our growth. We've been cutting.
But those
And
cuts have been at the school board's choice, because you decided to cut in this area as opposed to that.
given the budget constraints, we've had to make adjustments
Sure.
in order to support our priorities, which have been protecting the instructional bubble around students. But we're at the point where there's nothing much left to cut. And so if we don't allow for coverage of our enrollment growth, then we're necessarily going to have to absorb that. And that pretty much translates into larger class sizes. There's no place else to go.
I would also add that, you know, and as Chair Galloway said, we have seen every year the balance sheet tip to local government, the Board of Supervisors providing more revenues as the state has downsized its commitment. So as that's happened, and we've had things, for example, VRS took a huge chunk of funding in 1 year in order for us to be able to keep up with that commitment. And yet our employees really didn't gain anything from that in their pocketbooks, even though it looked like that they added 5% that year. So, you know, there are things like that that have really affected the overall cost of the system in terms of saying, yes, here's revenues for you as a school, but guess what? A significant portion of it's going to go into VRS. So that's been some of the tough kinds of things that we've had to really work with, as you have.
Right,
And I want to clarify that too, and certainly there have been reductions in administration positions, just
Correct.
as in local government.
Right.
People, the restructuring, all those things that has to be done to move what.
Right. I mean, the failure of the state to fund the schools has had reverberations throughout the county budget. I understand that, and I understand that we're looking at, you know, underfunding police and fire and rescue and social services as well. And that's why I'm pleased that we're united in lobbying our state government to give us additional revenue authority. But just as it translates to the schools, we've cut and cut and cut, and there's not much left to cut. I mean, last year, my first year on the school board, you know, we actually considered making students walk a mile instead of a half a mile to the school bus. And, you know, when we got to 5-year-olds crossing, you know, 5th Street Extended, we sort of gulped and said, let's do something different. But I mean, we're at that point, I think. How do we get here? We've already talked about a lot of this. We've made cuts across the board to the department and school budgets by 5%. We've modified staffing. We cut support. We significantly reduced professional development, et cetera. Cut teacher stipends. Teachers used to get additional funds if they taught an extra section of a course or an extra period. That's not completely gone, but it's significantly reduced. They've been asked to teach more courses, but they're not getting that extra money. And other things, you know, we would like this year, and it doesn't seem feasible, we'd like to actually fund, you know, a full year of salary increase. We'd like to have an additional resource officer. One of the cuts that we made after the Great Recession was eliminating our resource officers at the middle schools, which I think was a hard thing to do. And we have one resource officer, one school covered by a resource officer, and we've been hoping to add one a year, but we couldn't do it last year, and we can't do it this year. Elementary rural languages, we hope to have it expanded throughout our elementary schools. That would be an expense of $1.5 million. We're asking for $20,000 to study it. Oops, sorry. What else are we putting on hold? We have academies at 3 of our high schools. It's great. It's a great selling point for our schools. But if a kid in Hollymead wants to go to the environmental sciences academy at Western High School, there's no transportation. We can't afford getting them there. So you have to hope that everybody, all the kids in Western Academy want to be environmental scientists, and all the kids in the Monticello feeder pattern want to go into health sciences, and all the kids that go to, unless they have a private driver to take them there, because they enter as freshmen into these academies. We can't afford that. Full-time nurses at all schools. I really think it's a health and safety issue to have full-time nurses at our elementary school.
I will just make a comment here that probably because I'm in nursing, I pay attention to this, but this has been a wish of the school division for 17 years. I can tell you because when I first joined the school board, we started putting nurses in the schools. Matter of fact, that was why I ended up on the school board, was because the schools didn't have any nurses, except they had them at the high school level. And so to see this repeating itself now for 16, 17 years,
We
is just
had
really
last
amazing.
year, school division-wide, 160,000 visits to the school nurses. For many of our students, this is their primary source of health care. Yeah.
So it doesn't bring us any joy bringing the funding gap to you. I know it's continued. I mean, this is where we stand. Our job is to bring forward what we feel is the needs-based funding request. And we're bringing forward what we're saying is to provide the same need that we're providing in the current year. But due to the things that are out of our control in terms of inputs, there's additional revenue needed to cover it. Now, the $880,000 funding gap, as I mentioned before, the state just has not done their part to properly invest at their own levels to meet standards of quality. So the burden again falls to your tax base. And the $880,000, that can be equated to an additional half penny. And whether that goes to the tax rate or comes out of existing revenues, the simple piece is that the state is asking you to pick up that burden again if we're to provide the same level of need or the same level of service to meet our needs as in the current school year. If the additional revenues are not forthcoming, then what could happen to help close the gap if you do not provide that additional bit of revenue? Well, obviously, we're going to continue to watch what the state is doing. There could be adjustments, as we've seen occur over the last several weeks, that could help close that gap. So like you, I know we'll be watching what the state is doing closely and see where that falls. I mean, the adjustments we've seen from the fall again have been significant. Now, if we have to cut beyond adjustments, the new resource reduction, the professional development, the nurses, the behavior management coordinator, that $150,000 is pure new initiative. Those would likely be the first to be cut. Now, beyond that, the superintendent may have to make additional central office reductions. And at this point, that would mean that's going to go to instruction. So that'll be both instructional and instructional support type of things that go out to our schools. Now, we can decide not to fund enrollment growth. And that translates to an increasing class size, essentially. Now, like last year, the school board had a debate about, do you increase class size, and if so, how much? Or do you cut operations, and if so, how much? And last year, it was a balance between a cut to operations of 5%, and by that I mean the actual money that goes to each school level leader to fund, that they had at their disposal to fund their school, was cut by 5%. So that would likely be the conversation again in the debate. A further cut to an operational budget like that, or an increase in class size. The school board is obviously committed to holding compensation departments. We directed the superintendent and the county executive bring forward their mid-year piece they have. That is a new initiative, but that's an initiative that, although new, will not be on the table in our minds in terms of cutting. It'll have to be found somewhere else. Now, in conclusion, we do support the need for a citizen committee to address our long-term financial sustainability, and we very happy that you're championing that and it looks and moving that forward. We also support the need for a joint local government and school division internal review committee. The efforts will allow both our boards to achieve our strategic plans, but also tackle some things I think both boards need to tackle, such as pre-K and adult education needs. Now, the school board, I would also like personally to commend the Board of Supervisors for your creation of the Economic Development Office, and congratulate Faith McClintock as being named the first Director of Economic Development. Economic development is an obvious piece to this puzzle, and focusing on that in that way, I know, will help us figure the long-term financial sustainability of our county out, which is going to go a long way to both boards being able to do what they need to do inside their strategic plans. That does conclude our presentation, and we are obviously here. We have staff here at your disposal so that we can answer questions that you may have, and also discuss any items that you would like to discuss.
I have a couple of clarification, unless somebody else wants to do clarification.
Well, go ahead and do your clarification.
I know you have a figure in here for health insurance per person. So you said that $800,000 additional health insurance to cover 70 new people. That's like over 11,000
That might-
person? Question.
Those, I apologize for those numbers. I asked Lorna Jerome to give me a guesstimate, and I told her not to take time. I was after this morning,
All right.
but she thought it was around that. So I don't know what the actual cost are. I know that there are about 70 individuals, about 70 or so people that have
What is
come
the
over.
per person insurance cost? Does anybody know that?
8,000 a year.
It's about 8,000
About 8,000, so that must be
Right,
for
right,
people.
right, right, right,
because
right.
it's over 11,000.
Either the
I think we
eight-
estimated
either the
last
eight-
year's a little over $500,000.
Pardon?
It was a little over $500,000 for the
Some
70.
additional came in after
The
that.
additional.
Yes.
So the figure, the 800,000 may be the wrong figure.
Okay, I just was
right.
puzzling over that.
And unfortunately, one of the things that happened was when that change occurred at the university last year, it was in January, that we had to pick those up. So if you remember, we came back to you and said, oops, we've got to be able to cover this in this year, so we had to come and get some funding reappropriated to cover the cost. It also occurred at such a point where it wasn't built into the budget for this year. So we're also facing that a little bit, that we're going to have to cover some of that in this year. For next year, we at least have it built into the budget as a part of that overall insurance cost.
And what is a disadvantaged student? How is that defined?
But
Economically disadvantaged. So that would mean they qualify for free reduced loans.
So this chart right here.
Right.
And so that would be anybody that qualifies for reduced, not
Free or
free.
That's
Free or
Free
reduced.
or reduced.
Free or reduced. We're about 30% of the county.
And I really
28%.
appreciate getting this, because this is valuable for me, because I have a lot of questions from constituents about this. One of the questions that I have gotten is that this criteria has changed significantly sometime over the last recent years. Can you tell me?
I looked at that data. There's been minor adjustments to the eligibility numbers of income by size of family, but those are very small adjustments based on CPI. So if you want us to give you some of those comparisons, some of
I
the
wonder if it
years,
was significant.
there has been,
So-
not been
And the-
significant changes to
So a
eligibility.
family of 5 making $51,000 or less would be classified as a disadvantaged student.
Economic
They're
Disadvantaged
economically,
by your,
they're academically at risk, and we are required to categorize them in our testing. aren't we?
That's a federal definition.
And that's a federal requirement.
We don't
That's
define
why,
it that way.
well, we don't determine that, but we have to keep track of these academically at-risk student performance measures to make sure we are addressing the needs of all of our students, not just our high performers.
so when you gave a percentage of disadvantaged students in your presentation, that was referring to this, for instance, family of 5 under $51,000.
Right,
As an
if you look at the, right, if you look, so countywide, we are about 28.5%, something like that, of economically disadvantaged students under the state and federal classification. But that's really, really uneven. If you look at a school, we have schools that are 70–80%, and we have some that are 5 or 6. Yeah, yeah, and Lewis is about 6 or 7, right. So, yeah.
I just wanted to understand what a disadvantaged student, who a disadvantaged
But
student is.
this is not, these are not numbers that the Albemarle
Right,
County
we don't control
determines.
these numbers.
Right.
This is all, so they're all, and so every school system in the state and in the country
Right.
would use these same determinations.
I was just wondering what.
It's not Albemarle County determined, yeah.
It's the same
I think
thing.
there are some people that believe though, and I just tried to
Oh.
clarify that.
Right.
But we have staffing formulas that are designed around these numbers, right?
We have staffing formulas because.
Actually, we've changed
So
the
it does
staffing.
impact us directly because it's the staffing formula.
Right, it does, because we're held accountable for the performance measures of these.
Well, one of the adjustments that we've made over the years, though, is we used to have just a flat differentiated staffing model that you're citing, but in the past few years, we recognized that one of the ways to close our budget gap was to work with the schools in bands, because we found that large schools with large populations of economically disadvantaged students were, in some respects, had staffing that we could use in the other schools to address their needs and close the gap down. I think 2 years ago, we reduced the overall staffing by 6 FTE by doing that.
That we actually reduced our differentiated staffing.
Yeah, I
As
remember
part of
you
our,
said that last
yes.
year.
We chipped away at it.
But I think that one of the most critical pieces is that these are the same standards that you use for children that would be going into preschool. So that the reality is that while not every child whose family is on free and reduced lunch is a child that needs additional services, obviously that's true. And we have kids that are middle class kids that need intervention. But the reality is that we know from the national data that children that are living in poverty are more likely to come to our schools with needs that are greater than children that do not. And so we plan for that, particularly with the changing demographics in the urban ring, where we see more kids actually who are on free lunch and fewer that are on reduced lunch in terms of the mix of population today. So it is bringing us more challenge. I can tell you as an elementary principal that back in the 90s that it was closer to 15 to 16% countywide. So we've been those increases have been occurring, and it's not because the criteria have changed that much. It's really because of the fact that we have more families moving into the county, sometimes across just our county lines for the city, that have more challenging economic situations in their homes.
Well, it's other things too. It was interesting because just this weekend, I was speaking to someone from the International Rescue Committee, and she was explaining to me that the IRC has just moved into the urban ring in the last 6 months, 106 families.
Move from city to town.
No, into the
Urban
urban
ring.
ring, into
Albemarle.
The county.
specifically
But
the
historically,
counties,
for a long time, they were mostly in.
just in the
Right.
last.
Now
They've
they're
changed that mix.
They're about
into
80% of
the
the
Jack
county.
Jewett specifically Jack Jewett, 106 families. Now, some of those families may very well be just a husband and wife or a couple, but the majority of them have children that affect the school.
Where are they finding housing?
Pardon?
Where are they finding housing? I'm just kind of curious.
Well, I can tell you that
A lot of them
that
in
these
Diana's in my
106 moved
district,
into
yeah.
one particular housing unit that is mostly university. University housing, mostly university housing.
So they're moving into student housing.
Because I was contacted because they're asking help with getting a specific bus line from CAT established to pick the folks up when the university transit system is down because the university is closed. That's a whole nother discussion. But it was 106 families been moved in the last 6 months. So I'm just simply using that number to point out that in fact there are lots of things that are
We're
affecting
the
our
only,
schools.
the only location in this state that has an IRC.
Right. I think
So all of
there's,
them that come
So
through.
this is, the numbers can be pretty dramatic.
and as the housing costs in the city go up, they get pushed out to the county. But
I'm
these
just
were
curious about where you find
specifically-
affordable housing for all this families.
Well, Diane is
That's
right,
tough.
it's Copley Hill up there in that, it's in the county up there.
It's university housing,
Yeah.
and this particular one's not Copeland, but
Affiliated with the
it's.
university?
All I know is they've moved, their international rescue folks, that they've been moved into university housing.
That
It's
housing,
University Heights is this particular
the
one.
student housing is up behind you all, that area.
Kind of, but it's a
And-
lot of
It used to be
university.
only, it used to be, maybe that's changed, only for universities.
Well,
Right,
exactly.
but they bring their families as well, and you'll find probably 3 different generations in that housing yard.
And I don't want to distract from our discussion here, but the reality is that those families, 106 in 6 months, is pretty dramatic.
We also know that Woodbrook, which has not had traditionally IRC families, is receiving some, and of course you have Mallside and Ryan Hill, both that I think could be some housing spaces there that are low-income units. So, and we hear from the principals very clearly that that adds a stressor, because while those families receive some transition services from the IRC, their children belong to us, and there are no additional services that come inside the school to support those children to make that transition.
And the services stop at 6 months
Yes, they do.
for the hard stop.
Yes,
So
they do.
that's something else.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, rolling back on page 16, you were talking about the salary increase in November. When we talked about the salary increase in the fall, it was to begin in January. And then the county executive made a proposal for us to think about that maybe we could start it in October. And then what I think I heard Ned say is that that's a line in the sand as far as the school board is concerned. Because with local government and schools together, that's $1 million. That if we kept that, if I'm adding correctly, if we kept that in January, that would get us to market at the end of the year, before the end of the year, and would certainly almost close down your .88 gap all by itself. So I would like some explanation about that. And actually, while we're at it, and you may not have this today, one of the relationships to that October 1st date was that that's when the new health insurance costs were going to go in. So I would like to know at some point how much the increase in the health insurance costs are, not the raises or whatever, but the dollars that were going to be spread across the population, the employee population, starting in October 1st. Just because I'd like to know, and it may have some way that we can manage this a little bit better.
We have a practice of starting a list, which means if you can't answer that now, we can put it on Lori's list. Or if you happen to know, it'd be great to know that now.
And I presume that you would probably want that for both sides, since that October 1 date will impact all of our employees, to maybe break that out. So that could
Because
be
we
something.
certainly haven't, unless I was sleeping and missed something, we haven't decided that October 1st is the day.
We haven't
Something
talked
For
else.
the- for the insurance.
The line in
Not
the
for anything,
sand.
For the salary
Okay.
increase.
The
That's
line in
allowed.
the sand is the January 1 start date for the proposal. We are trying, as we said we would, I think in December, both the superintendent and the county executive mentioned that if there was a way, in some way, to offset health insurance increases at October 1, that we were going to look at that. The school board has looked at that and said that we can use monies from fund balance to fund that ourselves, so that we could start an accelerated quarter that would start October 1, but we're not asking you to pay for that. That is something that's already within our resources to do. We would be using one-time monies to do it. How would we do it? We have a couple different scenarios that we were looking at. But in regards to the $880,000 funding gap, that includes paying for a salary increase that starts January 1.
And with respect to the costs,
Slide is a little confusing.
It certainly is.
with respect to the health insurance costs, and, I mean, there are the premium costs, and as you know, there are also things that will show up on the paycheck, the higher co-pays and deductibles that are just out-of-pocket costs that we won't be able
What-
to. That'll be a function
Oh,
of
that's
utilization.
What could be
Pardon?
confusing is that
That's fine for everybody.
the school boards did wish to have, we would obviously would like, I think both boards would like to have a full year of salary increase. So what we're saying is if the board felt that they could do it, if the county executive has an idea to do a quarter, because that was bandied about as different ideas of how to do that, that if there was a way to provide that quarter, what would the cost be to go ahead and do that remaining quarter if the school division isn't passing on a full half year to you? So that could be something that, I mean, obviously we would like to do that for our employees, but from an expense standpoint in the current funding gap, if you fund with the January 1 start date, and we use fund reserve to pay for an additional quarter, that does not increase our funding gap that we're asking you that we brought forward in our funding request. The $690,000 is the cost associated with doing some version of a start October 1, and that $690,000 would come out of fund reserve, not adding to the $0.8 million.
Because it's one hour.
And it's ours.
So, but does it change your questions?
Well, I still don't know how many hundreds of thousands the increase in the health insurance costs are, which I would like to know at some point. But I think it does, the line in the sand is local government step up or else. Or we're not going to have the equalization across the two. Commonality, that's the word.
And with all due respect, that's not it at all.
That's not because they're going to do it out of fund balance, and my suggestion is that if the commonality is important and January 1st is the day to stick with, then that fund balance money might be used for some of these other very important things that you have talked
Well,
about.
I have to disagree with the way you contextualize that. The superintendent and the county executive were asked to bring funding requests forward with a salary increase starting January 1. The funding request that we brought forward does that. At the December meeting of the joint boards, we both said that we would like to see from the county executive, the superintendent, ways that could help offset increased costs by health insurance on October 1. The superintendent did not include that in her funding request. The school board is including it in their funding request to help do that for our employees. Whether the county decides to do that or not on their side is completely up to you. But I thought it was being explored based on our December conversations. If you decide to fund the current funding request, you're not paying for the additional quarter. That is in the school board's current request, and not an additional cost that's passed on. The funding gap remains at $880,000.
Tom, you look like you had something you were going to say.
No, my assumption is that wherever we end up, we want to end up in the same place, both organizations on salaries, and not have a difference in terms of the timing. And we need to get to the Board of Supervisors the additional cost of that one quarter based on what we think right now, either from one time or from some new revenues from the state. We think we could fairly easily meet that extra quarter, which would then align us with what they have already done, because their process is ahead of yours. So I think they just put it out there as an option. I think the assumption is that we would all decide to do that together on commonality, which again is just classified. Teachers are a different group. So.
And Tom and I have certainly had this conversation back and forth as I was asked by our board to do this. So I know that we've been talking about, as our two boards come together and start to talk about this, would we be both able to put some things on the table to try to get to that common ground one way or the other? I think everybody agrees we don't want to be where we were last year at the end, where we made a change and then the Board of Supervisors had to respond to that we prefer for it to occur one way or the other as a result of this. As you know, we have heard very clearly through our process that compensation is really, really important, and heard extensively from teachers about the critical nature of what they see as a morale issue and really as a workforce issue. And it scares me to death when I look at those numbers in Northern Virginia that you just saw. While some of those are not in our competitive market, I hear too often from teachers, you know, I could move to Madison and then jump on 29 and end up in Loudoun. And what a difference that would make in my life in terms of salary compared to here. I don't want to lose our good teachers to go up 29. I want to keep them here. So I know that that's part of our conversation.
And we did not want to come forward like last year and try to force a hand on something. We were trying to say, well, if we wanted to do something like this, then we have to make decisions within our own boundaries of what we have at our disposal in order to do it. And that will mean choices elsewhere. We didn't want to feel like coming forward was forcing your hand that, yeah, we want to do this and you have to pay for it.
I just have to say that the
way I interpreted your presentation was the way you just explained it now. I did not interpret it as an attempt not to maintain commonality.
Yeah.
Do you have some questions?
Just, Lorna probably needs to clarify that, and I don't see her. But my question is, Tom, I seem to remember, Tom, that, I can't remember the date, and I was trying to look at the agendas of the last year, but we approved additional health cost money because of additional people being covered of the UVA impact. June? That was June?
Yeah, we actually, you all actually appropriated
Right.
the additional money the schools and local government needed
Okay.
in June, right at the very end of the year, to cover that cost. So it didn't come out of their operating money.
So my question is, in addition to that, we're now seeing an additional demand because of the UVA healthcare impact?
That was only for 6 months, so
Right.
now it's a full year impact of this year.
Okay.
And
So
some
the-
additional piece.
So
will
what
be
you're
on-
talking about is what that appropriation was back in June?
It's the same amount, it's just a full year instead of a half year.
Just wanna
I think is what Dean's.
One question over here. Diane, do you have anything?
I don't have any questions about the presentation. I have a couple of
I've
questions.
got one question. On page 13 of our handout, you've got the per pupil state aid. And please recognize my information is dated, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the state reimburses us based on March 31st numbers as opposed to we calculate our needs for teachers based on September 30th. How much would that gap be less if you adjusted for that? Because it used to be, and again, I'm saying my information is dated, there was quite a considerable number of less students in March than there was in September 30th. Because of moving or whatever. And I understand why you do it that way. I'm not questioning that. I'm just kind of curious as to how much that gap would be reduced if you adjusted for the difference in counts.
I think we'd have to go back and put that.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of looked
It
at
is
that today,
based on
just kind of
It was
curious.
based on ADM in March, and we could do analysis of what the number was in September 30th and what it is today and what was September 30th last year and what the ADM ended up being. If you want us to go back a couple of years, we could do
Because
that
that's,
for you.
I mean, if you're going to compare that, you need to take into consideration, and I think, and again, it's, my information is dated, but it used to be that it was.
All of these revenues are calculated based upon ADM.
So in other words,
The
that
number
chart
that the
is an
state actually
ADM.
delivers to us is
Okay.
calculated upon the numbers.
Okay.
It's not
adjusted
September
for the
30th.
The September 30 data is what our student enrollment growth charts are based on. So we show what our increase, what we're projecting and what the increase is currently, that's based on September 30.
And those are the.
But I
children
think
who
what
get
Jackson was
higher
saying, this is based on,
This is ADM.
This is ADM, the student enrollment growth is
so
September.
it wouldn't
30.
change, wouldn't it be the same?
Anything else, Ken?
No.
Julie, any comments?
I just have a request. Yeah, one thing I would thank staff for is I see that Ken had a couple of questions that he emailed in recently, and we haven't answered. Can you see your question,
Yeah, I did.
answers to your questions?
Well, I talked to Jackson now.
Okay, so
Yeah, I
this is,
appreciate
that's
that.
good. That's great. I wanted to just thank the school board, and I think the board of supervisors who participated as well in the new look and the way the budget's presented this year. It is very user-friendly. It's much clearer. I think our community will like it as well. So I know we had teams of committee groups, but, and I know Jackson worked hard. And probably Lori as well, whoever's involved, this is really good. I really did like especially the, which is new to see, the schools broken out by cost. And that drives me to another question. I would really like to have back, so you can put this on the question, the answer list. If I could see a report or just a quick answer to the cost per school of each of the students. So for example, at Jack Jewett, the per pupil cost is this, at Western Albemarle is that. And I think you could do it fairly quick, but I would appreciate having that back.
I really appreciate it, and as we have said, that this is a first step in revised and revitalized format for our budget book. But one of the other things that you'll notice in here that I would just say that as you're looking at the departments, we've also added in some of the department metrics that we use to measure what those departments are trying to accomplish or the services that they provide. So I would just draw your attention that that's something that you might not notice, but because it is a part of those departments, and if you get caught in the numbers, you might not do the reading through the text. But take a look at those metrics. We're pretty proud of the fact that our departments are really working on some very clear objectives in terms of the services that they provide.
So Diantha, are you wanting the per pupil expenditures
Per school.
this year or in the next iteration?
The ones
of
that you
budget
have
book?
here.
Okay.
The ones that you have in the
So
budget.
you want
book.
to
Not,
So-
I don't want you.
So
yeah,
you get
okay.
to see what does it cost to educate a child at Jack Jewett versus Burley.
Right,
versus-
right.
Okay.
I can't put my fingers on it, but I know I read it in here, so I know it's in the chapter.
I'd just like to see it broken down by school.
It is,
Yeah.
because it shows one school at 390 and another one at 178.
No, I don't think it is. Dean's shaking his head. It's
I wouldn't
not.
have seen it.
I think you're right, it's that there is a per pupil sort of at the, but I think what you're asking for is the bigger,
Exactly.
sort of a put them all on one page.
Exactly.
That the 12,000
'Cause I think that
per
there's-
student is an
it's a-
average.
yeah.
Right, depending on.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
You're exactly right.
Yeah, and saw it, so I apologize.
No, it's,
But if I can
can't
have
find
it just
though,
as
so
one,
I don't
not
know.
having to go through. The other thing I wanted to just say, comment, I guess, is that I'm really glad to see you all putting money back into professional development. What's concerning to me is that I understand that we have PTOs that are raising money and providing professional development for their teachers at schools. And what's concerning about that is that really leaves a gap of differentiation in between what some teachers at some schools are getting and what others
They
are
tend to be
getting.
higher income schools.
Exactly, and I just find that concerning. So I'm really glad to see the professional development piece. Even though it's not adequate, at least there's a little bit more there. Yeah, and I'm sure she's right.
Well,
I just missed
I
it.
wish I could find it because
I believe
I
you.
would reassure myself, but I'm not imagining.
Yeah, no, I believe you, it's there. It would be nice though to have it on one page, to be able to kind of look at it.
Let's put that on the list.
Yeah.
In that last section.
I was impressed by what we were talking about. Liz's question answered a couple of mine. And what you were saying about how pre-reduced lunch means you have more remediation, more needs, more expense. So as that percentage grows, or it has grown, that really taxes the school division's resources in a different way. Which leads me to the pre-K program. And I believe, and Ned, I think you and I talked about this earlier on, I believe, and I don't see Tom, but Bill, we haven't gotten to our general government side, but we've funded the pre-K program this year, at least at the level from last year. Or did we increase it? Oh, there's Josh. Or where's
Yeah.
Some of
Yes,
it.
we did.
We did, okay.
Proposed budget recommends funding to the department.
All right, but equal to last year?
Yes, to last year to maintain the program level that's currently being provided in those schools.
I would like to know, just for our list, if we could fund it to the level where we weren't giving any matching funds from the state on the table.
Okay.
I know that still won't reach our need, at least from the couple of briefings we had last year, but I'd love to know what that figure is. But it leads me to say that if we really look at that program, granted it's not K through 12, but it may help with this whole expense that you're grappling with in pre-reduced lunches, because those are the same kids that qualify. I'm correct about that. If we could get to the
A
point.
subset of those kids.
If we could get to the point where we are fully funding our pre-K program, at least for that group, that has dividends not only for later in life for our citizens and our budget, but it will really help, I think, later for you.
It does, and I would certainly say that the research is very clear. The children that are in White Stars or that are in our even our special education preschools, we know when we look at their data that they are starting school with much deeper skill sets than kids that have not had that experience. I will say this, Debbie Collins felt like that a year ago that we were going to have we have two Title I funded preschools in the county, and she was worried we were going to lose one this next year. But I believe, Debbie, that you've been able to figure out how to hold on to that program.
We'll use carryover that we have from trying to make sure that we are saving as we go along this year.
Out of our title. No, that is Title I.
That's Title I.
Yeah, we have.
And then we have Head Start and some.
Yeah,
I don't want to get
and that's
into the weeds here, I
MACA,
just-
yeah. So we
Alright.
have 2 Title I funded that come out of our budget that have some blendedness with Bright Stars. We have the Bright Stars programs, then we have Head Start, and we have special ed preschool. So we have 4 different sources that but one thing I would also say is that the other thing that we know from looking at more urbanizing areas is that sometimes people think you're going to get rid of a significant amount of funding for intervention because of a preschool, but because of oftentimes the transients that you have with kids that may come and go from places that don't, you don't always get the full benefit. Because what did you find, Dean, in one of our elementary schools? You looked at the children in kindergarten, and then you looked at that cohort of children in 5th grade.
Actually, system-wide, 35% of the cohort starting kindergarten had left the school system by 5th grade. So
But
it
it's
means you have
also-
to keep remediation, not just in the preschool, but
continuing.
But it's also the case that it's, I think, unrealistic to think that preschool by itself is going to be enough to support kids all the way through school, because a lot of them do come through, it's nice if they are socialized, they have some concrete skills learned in pre-K, they've held a pencil. I had a teacher say that, she has kindergartners show up who've not been to pre-K, who haven't even held a pencil before, much less had, books read to them. It is, I think, a tragedy to have kids being behind the first day of kindergarten. And that's what we would eliminate if we had pre-K. Of course, our enrollment growth, this is sort of going off, has ramifications beyond our operating budgets, but also in our capital budgets, because we are accommodating pre-K in our existing schools, many of which are already at or near capacity. And so that has to be discussed also, because we're trying to house our pre-K in the schools where they're going to go. Try to engage the kids, of course, but also engage their parents in education. So that's just another consideration for another day.
It's one of the questions our long-range planning, I know, is going to be,
Right.
they're coming tonight to ask questions for guidance from the school board, and one of their questions is, from a facility standpoint, what
Where are you
do we
gonna put 'em?
accommodate pre-Ks?
I know that's on the Let's zoom ahead to late high school and talk about that national figure that is also quoted by people here in our community, that 59.7% of the kids who matriculate to 4-year schools return home, or at least leave, without a degree, sometimes with student debt, and they don't have real job training skills, which leads me to my K-Tech question. I think we're interested in K-Tech from the adult ed standpoint. That's more our playground. You were citing, Kate, you were citing lifelong learning. We're trying to instill that. One of our
That's our mantra, yeah.
One of our strategic goals is lifelong learning, accessibility for. So I was noting in here that we actually have a reduction in K-Tech. And that was last year too. Would you help me understand where we're going with K-Tech?
Well,
Go ahead.
K-Tech's, or
I mean,
Kate is on the K-Tech.
yeah. Well, Pam will certainly jump in. I mean, the reduction, there's the adult ed piece of it, and then there are our high school students that go to K-Tech. And the reduction is in that side of the equation, the students going to K-Tech from our schools. The adult ed is self-sufficient economically. I mean, it is funded by a combination, depending on whether it's a regular program or apprenticeship program. It is funded fully by tuition, and if it's an apprentice program, state funds. And then we actually make a tiny bit of money in terms of testing for certifications. So the adult ed after high school piece is not a financial, it is financially self-sufficient from the K-Tech budget.
And look, before you move into what's going on with the reduction, when I did my tour at K-Tech about a month ago, with Steve Colazar and Bruce Bosman took us around. He said that we have a shrinking adult education program, that the marketing, I don't know, he didn't attribute it specifically to anything, but he said, we'll throw a class out there, we'll get a couple of people, we can't afford to have a teacher. It sounded like there wasn't a lot of investment, but I don't want to jump to that conclusion, and I don't want to have a huge, long conversation about this now. I just really would like us to be focusing on it, noting that it's cut. It may have been cut because, you know, they cut a whole lot of things, and K-Tech was on the chopping block. I just want to know.
Let me address that very clearly. The K-Tech budget that's in this book is strictly high school.
Right.
That is based on a funding formula that we share with the city, so that every year that what happens is that the director of K-Tech, based on the projected enrollment of kids coming from the county, coming from the city, assesses this is what the county needs to pay us to run the program, this is what the city needs to pay us. Because the K-Tech high school enrollment has also trended down, and some of that's because we have programs that we have not offered because we don't have kids enrolling. An example would be that we were offering a course in green technologies, and we didn't have kids that were interested in taking that course, so we eliminated it. We've eliminated 3 programs from last year to this year because there was not enough enrollment in the high school program. In rebuilding this new academy model, our goal is that we are going to fully enroll kids in those programs. We have some new courses we're going to offer this next year. One is medical coding, another is an IT course. So our goal is that we're going to rebuild that. When I came on as superintendent, over the early part of the 2000s, we had close to 500 kids at K-Tech. Now, one of the reasons why that's downdrafted a bit is because we've built better, more robust CTE programs in our high schools. So we've got more kids staying there. But that adult ed program is totally self-sustaining and doesn't touch this book at all. That program actually brings money into the K-Tech budget from the adult ed. We actually gain a little bit of money from that. But it is the student side, the high school side, that's gone down. The numbers, we're getting assessed less of an expense for K-Tech because we're sending less kids. Same for the city.
Yeah, could you just say what CTE means?
Career technical education.
So like in our presentation with the costs, our other regional program or joint program is PrEP, which serves special education services, and 9 different counties are part of that, and our costs have actually gone up. So that is seeing an increased enrollment to the students that need special ed services. So it's a supply-demand piece. We have a bigger demand on that particular program, so the costs have gone up, but the demand on K-Tech is, because they cut Mason, I mean, there were some program cuts that they made.
One of the things that I will say about the K-Tech work that's unfolding, and Kate certainly is on the board to speak to this, is that we're in an intensive hunt to be able to have both a strategic side of that shop and a principal of K-Tech side. The 2 of those positions, one would be very much oriented towards how do we build relationships in the business community, figure out what the business community really needs from K-Tech in terms of skill sets, work with PBCC as well as folks in the business community, and build these academies and the relationships, and also look for other sources of funding. So that position we're in progress for filling right now. We also, with Bruce Bosselman as interim director, are in the search for a person that will run the school side of it, work with our 4 comprehensive high schools in the city and the county to really go out and get kids invested in wanting to be involved in that program, with the goal that we will have within 2 years a very robust, what you might consider to be a workforce hub that would be looking at developing out both the adult ed and the high school side of that work. And one of the things that we're really looking forward to is with Faith McClintock coming on board, one of the things that we know is that she's going to have a real interest in that workforce development. And so we want to be sure that we're bringing people like that to the table to help us really go after that.
So you wouldn't say it's anemic, then you would say you're poised to...
I would say that we want the trend going in the different direction.
Right.
How few students are there?
We have about, at last count from Mr. Bosselman, we were running in the 260s. We were right at 300 this past year. So
So that's the size of a small elementary school.
it is the size of a small elementary school. And there are a lot of factors that really affect our kids going there. One of the things that we hear over and over again from kids, and particularly if you're in the western side of the county, if you're at Western Albemarle, to go to K-TEC for a half-day program means that you're really having to give up periods out of your day for travel. And so, you know, we don't get the enrollment from Western that perhaps we get from Albemarle that's much closer. So we're talking about, if we think of this as a hub, how do we really think about the entire community really being part of the K-TEC environment? Whether it's PVCC, the campuses that exist right now, the high schools, and maybe using our workforce opportunities to have more apprenticeships of kids out in the field. So,
And I think as we develop our academy model, that may also be an appeal for more adult ed who might be
Absolutely.
interested in.
Well,
some of
that's where
those
the
fields.
relationship
Right.
with
So-
PVCC
So I have to
comes
say,
in.
we're in transition. It was challenging to lose Adam Hastings right when we were launching all of this, but it's on track, and I think we're going to come to a really good place in the next year.
Great, that's great to hear.
So we're optimistic.
And the classes which are offered in the high school building, do those offer certificates?
Yes, some of them do.
Okay.
In fact, one of the things that I'm really appreciative is that each of our academies, MESA, the Health and Medical Sciences, and now the Environmental Studies, all carry joint CTE, dual enrollment, and regular high school credit.
There's a new state requirement that if you're getting a standard diploma, you have to earn an industry certification. So that would be at the regular high school. Even if you did go to K-TEC, you have to earn it.
It's out there somewhere.
Do you have, I was going to follow on with some comments about the state that you brought.
I'll just leave it out to people to think about.
Okay. To update you on the state, Ann Malik and I went down to lobby the Senate Finance Committee about enabling authority for a cigarette tax. Before we left that day, a bill was going to be presented for all counties other than Arlington and Fairfax that already had it. So we're kind of excited about speaking to that. When we got there, the Senate Finance Committee had decided to shrink it down to just considering for Isle of Wight, which actually, at least we thought, well, this will start the ball rolling. That didn't go anywhere. And I'm going to save a comment with regard to what the chair of the Finance Committee said with regard to property taxes for another meeting. But I wanted you to know, Mr. I wanted you to know that subsequent to that, Liz Palmer and I flew down at the General Assembly and we met with each of our delegates and senators and presented them with a letter from our board, which is the letter that we decided would go each and every time we were faced with a state mandate or a shortfall in their funding, each and every time. So when we got to November, it would not be new news to them about what we face, not only in our schools, but in general government. So we delivered the first of what I have a feeling will unfortunately be a number of letters. So I'm not going to take up our time, but on page 6, the mandated slide, it says directed mandated. I'm going to follow up with whomever just to find that out. We may be able to send a slew of letters just there. And then your slides about the state shortfall. I think we'll wait till after they pass their budget and we pass our budget so we can really make sure we isolate the right figures. And certainly I'll copy you all on any letter that we send
I would appreciate.
I think having the school board sending other letters in addition to fill the mailbox.
It's a good idea.
And it gives
I think
us
so.
it's like Ann said, Jim Fidel, who's the vice chair of Green, spoke. Any of you all that went to the legislative meeting we had at Fifth Street, which predated the luncheon by about a month. You remember the supervisor from Green who said, you know, let's hear it right out of your mouth. You want us to go to the property tax to make up the things that you're not living up to in our budget. So I saw him yesterday. I told him we were sending these letters, and he said you should get that format of that letter out to all the school boards in the planning district and all the boards of supervisors so they can send their own letters. So we can take responsibility for reaching out to the other boards of supervisors if you all would like to do that. You can see a copy of our letter. You don't have to use the same format, but you can see what we're saying. If you do that with the school boards, I think we'll be in a much better position in November for one of those other strategies, which is working with the state in a new way.
I did actually announce that at the last PACO meeting to all the supervisors around the table and suggested they all do the same. They thought that was a great idea. So maybe we can have a movement on it.
Well, it gives you a great paper trail that you can then, we can use later.
Before I close up, do you have something?
I just kind of thought, and I raised this last year, so I don't know if it will get any support at all, but I understand the great concern on the part of teachers that their workload has increased dramatically and their compensation has not. So again, to have us think about doing raises for the teachers, people up to a certain level, whether it's $80,000 or whatever the appropriate level of salary would be, the people who really need the raise the most. And I don't have any details with it, but I would like to be able to know what the cost of that would be and how it would affect our overall ability to fund the other things that we're not.
I have a question that I forgot to ask. How long do you plan on going without hiring another assistant superintendent? I'm just curious. I'm wondering.
Well, I have no plans to hire that right now because I have to tell you that when I talk to special ed parents who talk about the need for our regular ed teachers to receive training in working with children that have specific needs, when I talk to teachers who are paying out of pocket to go to conferences that are adding great value to our school system, that as much as and I will tell you that when you go from having 3 people to 2 people returning phone calls and working on problems, and a person who was the assistant superintendent for student learning, it means that we've picked up that work. But the reality is that every year what we have done is to prioritize our schools over central support. So that position's in the budget to fund professional development for teachers. And if I could double that amount, I would double it tomorrow. But, and I appreciate what you say about compensation, Ms. Malik, because one of the things that we've talked about is that, you know, when the board asked us for options, we shared if we wanted to take teachers to a full year, even if it was out of fund balance, to give them a full year of 2%, this is what it would cost, this is what it would cost for all employees, this is what it would cost to do a partial. But I do believe that for what I call the most important profession in the United States of America, that our educators really are working very, very hard. And it's not just Albemarle, it's everywhere. But I can't solve a problem for a Loudon teacher, but we can sure try to solve it for our Albemarle teachers.
Madam Chair, before we wrap up, I would like to, it was interesting this year, the new format, and watching school board members use the new format. So I appreciate it. And I know a lot of your comments went into helping us figure out this new format. So just,
It's really great.
well, what I would prefer is, since it is something new that was brought forward, is to ask that if you do have continued feedback and anything that you could share, if you could send that over to us, because I want to make sure that's there even for the next round as we start working, that'll be there. So if you feel like something could be improved, or like some of these points, that we would certainly welcome additional feedback to keep improving on what we think is a good format at this point.
Have you had citizens asking you for a copy of this? They're going to get it all on.
Where it goes, I mean, the nice, I guess, part is the superintendent's request goes up immediately, and then the school board's goes up, so they get to even see the iterations of it.
I'm sorry, but one of the really nice things that I've heard from parents this year is they love being able to go to one budget site that has local government and schools all together. So they really appreciate that, and it's searchable, so that's helpful. But I was with Parent Council last night, and one of the things that we talked about, and I used, Tom, some of your slides from our joint session yesterday morning, and one of the things that our parents are really appreciating getting educated about are some of the issues that our local government's facing, because they're not aware of social services, in some cases, challenges, or the police department's challenges, or fire and safety. So being able to share our slides jointly has really, I think, helped us to educate a greater swath of our community about the joint challenges that we face and how we're trying to solve those. So I appreciate that. And Tom and I yesterday morning had an opportunity to work together with a business community group. And so, you know, it really has been something that I think has been has really helped us this year on the school side to feel much more confident and comfortable that the integrated package of the way we're thinking about budgeting is something that benefits the whole community. So thank you for pushing us on that.
Well, as I said, the book is readable and even I can understand it, and that's a really good thing. I appreciate it very, very much. And also to encourage your constituents, your parents, and everybody to know how powerful their voice is in Richmond. I don't know if school board members went down to lobby. I can see the familiar faces down there when we were there, but that doesn't mean you weren't there. But to make sure that these citizens speak up individually. You know, 1,000 letters makes a big, big difference to somebody who's
Absolutely.
running for office. So they need to be told.
To speak to that, I am aware, we did have some school board members who went down, but there is, I believe, some effort on some different pockets of teachers in our county who are doing that very thing. So I will certainly continue to encourage that too.
And parents as well. We share these slides with them, and it definitely gets their attention that
That $8 million that they used to be giving, but they're not anymore, would take care of a whole bunch of funding.
Yes, it would.
So that all by itself is enough reason to say you're not even living up to your own standards. Come on.
Well said. In closing, you mentioned the citizens committee, and we're not quite sure what that's going to look like. We know we want to charge them soon and get them working. We know we want the results of that work to feed into a 5-year plan and therefore the next budget cycle. We're not going to be on a 2-year study. The University of Virginia is not a comparable parallel to a local school system. But years ago, I was a trustee for the College of Arts and Sciences, for 8 years. At that time, we saw the writing on the wall that state funding was not going to do it, and it kept shrinking, although state control remained, because you take one penny and you fall under our state's jurisdiction. So we developed strategies to help us. It's still a challenging financial environment, but we developed strategies. Our strategies as local government and our school system have to be different. But we are going to figure this out. And I don't think we're just scratching our heads thinking, what in the heck did we figure out? We do have some ideas. And so I want to be hopeful moving forward that we'll be in a different place next year. For 2 reasons. I think we've got some good ideas to study, but also, remember those delegates and our senators said, well, it's an election year and it's a short session. Next year is not an election year and it's not a short session. So I think that they're going to have to take this very seriously if we're ready to have that discussion, and I think we will be. I want to thank you for a really good faith presentation. This year feels dramatically different, even though there's shortfall, we need to process this. We'll send any questions that we have through Lori, you, or should we send them to Lori? Okay, we'll send them to Lori to figure out who to get it to, and we look forward to continuing on through this process. With your terrific presentation, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're going to take this pretty quick.